So welcome everyone. My name is Hedi Viterbo. I'm a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University in the UK and the founding director of the Childhood Law and Policy Network, CLPN, which is hosting this event. Delighted to host this event. Our topic today is children's food practices or children's relationship with food and discourses and practices surrounding that area. And this session is part of a 4-webinar series, which is dedicated more broadly to discourses and practices around children's bodies. So we'll put the link to the series now in the chat in case anyone's interested. You're welcome to attend the remaining webinars. We had a webinar on children and sport. Our next webinar is on childhood and disability. And the last webinar is on children's gender/sex. So all of those themes, there are some commonalities, and we're looking at them from broader sociological, historical, comparative, philosophical, and other perspectives. So it's also a very cross-disciplinary discussion that we're having. I'll say a couple of words about CLPN, the network. Some of you may be familiar with us. Those who aren't, you're just welcome to Google CLPN. You'll find our website. We do all sorts of exciting things. We have nearly 600 researchers as members around the world who are from various disciplinary backgrounds and geographical locations interested in issues around childhood and children. What we do, we publish original content such as blogs, interviews with authors of new books on issues concerning childhood and children. We have on our website a hub of research, online research resources and teaching resources. And also one of the many things we do is host this webinar. Today we're privileged to have with us 3 fantastic speakers from 3 different countries. So I want to start by saying a bit about each of them, and then I'll explain the format of our webinar today. I will mention, though, that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online, so I guess choose your words carefully. So our first speaker today is Jennifer Patico, who's a professor and chair of anthropology at Georgia State University in Atlanta in the US. Jennifer's a socio-cultural anthropologist who's conducted ethnographic research in both Russia and the US, and she's the author of 2 books. One is titled Consumption and Social Change in a Post-Soviet Middle Class, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2008. And the other book is titled The Trouble with Snack Time, Children's Food and the Politics of Parenting, which was published by NYU Press in 2020. Jennifer's research has focused on middle-class identities, experiences of self and personhood, understandings of value, and the ways in which all of these issues are mediated through consumer culture in settings of contemporary capitalism. The second speaker is Sarah Gillborn, who's an assistant professor of psychology and education at the University of Birmingham here in the UK. She's a critical psychologist interested in critical feminist and qualitative research. Sarah's research focuses on analyses of discourse and voice, especially in relation to public policy, in order to understand how social issues are officially constructed and negotiated by those implicated by them. Sarah's work also takes a critical look at the role of psychology as a discipline in reproducing and challenging oppression. Finally, Tina Moffat is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Tina's areas of expertise are the social and cultural determinants of food, nutrition, and food insecurity, with a focus on maternal child food and nutrition and immigrant dietary change. Her research perspectives are grounded in biocultural and political economic approaches in the geographic areas of Canada and Nepal. Among her recent publications related to children's food and nutrition are the book Small Bites, Biocultural Dimensions of Children's Food and Nutrition, which was published by the University of British Columbia Press in 2022, and also a chapter titled Children's Food, Historical, Sociocultural, and Public Health Perspectives, which was published in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Food Studies. So really a wonderful panel, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing from. And our format today is primarily a panel discussion where I'll pose quite broad questions to our panelists, and each of them will address the question drawing on their own expertise and background. Then we'll have time left for a Q&A. So first of all, you're welcome to post any questions you have in the chat during our panel discussion, which we will collect and answer later. You're also obviously welcome to post questions in the chat after the panel discussion, but also if you're happy to do that, just unmute yourself later. You're very welcome to turn on your camera if you're not too shy. And we'll be happy to hear / see from you, but there's also, as I've said, the option of the chat. In the meantime, if you could keep yourself muted, just so we don't have too many background noises, that would be great. Okay, so our speakers, you can all unmute yourselves. I'd like to kick off the panel discussion with maybe kind of a preliminary question, which will help all of us understand where you're coming to the discussion from. If each of you could say a bit about the social issues regarding childhood and food that you've explored in your own research, and also what drove you to study these issues. So there isn't a particular order. Maybe we can go alphabetically. Jennifer, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Hedi, for all of that introduction. So what are the social issues regarding childhood and food that I've explored in my research? I guess the first thing to say briefly is the nature of my research. I conducted an ethnographic study about 10 years ago now. So that's really my main project on children's food. It was situated at a charter school in Atlanta. And for those who are outside of the US context and might not know what a charter school is, it's a public school, publicly funded school, but it operates outside of a regular public school district and has its own pedagogical approaches, its own administrative governance, and so on. So it's sort of almost like a melding of a private and a public school, but it is publicly funded. So I conducted research in that context. I was I was mainly talking with parents in that context, but also school administrators. And I also spent a lot of time in the schools. It was a school with a middle school and an elementary campus. So that was the age range from kindergarten through 8th grade. And I was able to spend a lot of volunteer time at the school, mostly passively kind of observing students, but also did a little bit of actual concerted research with students where I was co-teaching a class. And was able to, through an IRB process, collect some data from those middle school students as well. But attending PTA, Parent Teacher Association meetings, stuff like that, and then a lot of in-depth interviewing with parents. And what I was talking about with them tended to be pretty nitty-gritty details of how they went about their days and weeks, figuring out how they were going to feed their kids. But ultimately, what I was interested in analyzing was not so much what they actually ate or what they actually fed their kids, but really in how parenting and childhood were being constructed in these conversations, and also how class and understandings of diversity were happening in these conversations. And I'll just throw out a couple of things that emerged to me as important that maybe we'll have time to talk a little bit more in the subsequent questions. One was that I really became interested in kind of the parenting anxieties that got expressed when we were talking about food. And one thing that really emerged was people's concern to negotiate the need, on the one hand, to carefully regulate what their children were eating, to avoid undue harm to their children's health, but then at the same time, a concern not to be overly controlling, not to be seen by others as overly controlling, and to respect their children's autonomy and tastes to a certain degree. So a lot of tension around that issue. Another one that I was really focused on was the significance of class and access to resources, not just financial resources, but also time, as something that mediated the ways people thought about food, did food, how they perceived other people's food challenges, and then also how the class component of all of that sometimes became occluded in the way people talked about food and the kind of moral aspects of what it meant to be a good parent vis-a-vis food. So I could talk more about that later. And ultimately, I got interested in just thinking about kind of broader questions of responsibility for children's food and to what extent it's serving anybody, even those who can afford the best the market has to offer in the US, to leave as much responsibility for regulating the quality of children's food to individual parents and households, and whether there might be more conversations to have about the role the state and food industry would play in taking on that responsibility as well. And then just to say what motivated me to the study, as Hedi mentioned, I had an earlier interest in thinking about class and selfhood and kind of how people inhabit the economy through their consumer practices. And that was kind of the foundation for this work, but also my own experiences as a mother and knowing that this was something where a lot of attention was being invested by people, knowing that this would be kind of rich for exploration into their experiences of personhood and value making as well as class.
Thank you so much. So there's a lot of, would it be cliche to say food for thought, but a lot to work with. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So the bulk of my work in this area was my PhD, which I completed in 2020. That was a study of a program, a state program in UK schools called the NCMP, or the National Child Measurement Program. So what that program does is that every state maintained school must take part in this, and children in reception, which is usually age 4 to 5, and year 6, so age 10 to 11, every year are essentially screened for obesity and have their BMI measured. The result of this, the first early intention of it was to just be a kind of obesity monitoring program, but it changed into a screening program about 3 years into its operation, although that went against the guidance of the National Screening Committee. And what turned it into a screening program rather than just a monitoring one was the inclusion of these results letters that get sent home to parents. So telling parents what their child's BMI is, which would either be the categories were defined as underweight, normal weight, overweight, or very overweight, which is kind of used instead of the word obesity. And with those letters, parents are sent kind of hints and tips leaflets about how to maintain a healthy weight, which includes kind of advice around food, which I also found similar to what Jennifer just talked about, how that kind of advice was making kind of a lot of assumptions about access to food, access to activities, and also making a lot of assumptions about what parents were doing anyway and what their kids were doing. So there were 3 parts to this, really, 2 kind of empirical studies. Firstly, I did a review of literature in childhood obesity. looked at how it's talked about in research, and in that aspect, I did find very particularly classed and raced ways that it's talked about. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit more with one of our next questions that comes up. The first empirical study I did was a discourse analysis of the materials related to that programme. So I was particularly, what I looked at was how obesity and health were discursively constructed in those materials, and then also looked at the role of parents and how they were being constructed. And I found that health and weight were very much kind of spoke about as being one and the same. So a healthy child is a child who is not overweight or obese, and actually also saw a lot of kind of constructions of even underweight children being considered, not a risk, not something to worry about, because there's this kind of construction of it's not normal weight that's the ideal, but distance from overweight or obesity that are seen as the problem. And I also saw these constructions of parents as really being either the saboteurs of their own children's health or those who could save it as long as they go along with kind of what the state is saying in those materials. The second study within that project then was an interview study with mums whose children had recently been invited to be measured. I was also interested in talking to mums who opted their children out, because it's an opt-out programme. And I did speak to a couple of mothers who did opt their children out, but I wanted to hear from them as well as those who didn't, to kind of hear their engagement with the programme and their feelings on it. And that used a method called feminist relational discourse analysis. So I was interested in the discourses that those women were drawing on, but I also was conscious of how discourse analysis, when used on data from people and interviews, can sometimes take their voices out. So with feminist relational discourse analysis, it was about kind of looking at how these women were negotiating different competing discourses and also how they were positioning themselves within them. And one of the things I found there was this impossible position that mums were kind of placed in, where they were sometimes challenging the assumptions about their children's health based on their BMI and saying that they know their children, they know that they're healthy, and also not wanting to cause issues with their children's more holistic health and well-being by telling them there's something wrong with them and by following the kind of guidance that's given to them. But then on the other hand, those discourses of, the horrors of obesity, and even children who were receiving normal weight letters were having kind of warnings attached to them that, that they're normal now, but there's a risk that they might one day end up being overweight or obese. And those messages were so strong that mums who wanted to kind of resist, the pathologization of their children's bodies were still feeling as though they had to decide whether or not to do what was being suggested of them and have difficult conversations with their children in the interest of their health, or to not have those conversations, encourage their children who are as young as 4 to, love themselves and continue to be who they are and do what they do. But if they did that, they were being positioned very much as the kind of saboteurs of their own children's health. So there's a lot of, as you were talking, Jennifer, I was thinking, yes, this is absolutely something that's come up for me before. In terms of why I was motivated to study this, I've always been interested in research that highlights and seeks to challenge sexism, classism, and racism in particular. And increasingly, during my undergrad, I was kind of engaging with critical health work that was looking at how obesity and politics around obesity are often mobilized in ways that are gendered, raced, and classed. And it seemed like a route through which kind of, ostensibly neutral and well-meaning health initiatives were kind of being, were operating in ways that were reproducing racism and classism and sexism, with the kind of it really being mums in particular who are positioned as at fault or responsible for their children's health. So that's what led me to it. And it was my PhD was where I did much of the work that I have done in this area.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot there. It's so fascinating how rich um, the how messy and rich the reality obviously is, but also the research. And I think one of the themes, as you mentioned, is almost the impossible position that parents feel like the placed in, where they have to strike all these impossible balances between different things, both in terms of, Jennifer, you mentioned earlier, in terms of regulating how much intervention is good intervention into their children's eating habits, and also, Sarah, you mentioned how much they should communicate with their children, how open they should be. And I think some of these things have to do, I don't want to say too much, but I think some of these things also have to do with tensions within the child rights discourse, where we're told that children are supposed to be protected, but also their autonomy is supposed to be respected. And there is potentially an inherent tension there. And obviously, just tensions around what is a good parent, what is a normal childhood, and so forth. So I hope we'll be able to explore some of these themes later, either in the discussion or during the Q&A. But I've said too much. Tina, your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Hedi. And thanks. It's nice for you to pause there and kind of pick up on some of the themes so far. I'm going to try to connect my work with some of those themes as well. And I've been doing this work for a while in a number of different projects, so I'll just try to give you some highlights. Starting in the 1990s, when I was doing my doctoral research in Nepal, and I was looking at families who had migrated from rural village communities to Kathmandu to work in the carpet making industry. So parents were weaving in and working as wage laborers, and they had these young children. So my study actually focused on children from birth to about 5 years of age, but really looking at how parents, and particularly the mothers, were negotiating this productive wage labor that they were doing in their reproductive maternal care work. And this particular region or area just outside of Kathmandu where they were working was very characterized by a lot of environmental sanitation issues. This community was living with high food insecurity, a lot of parasitic diseases, and it was really challenging for them to bring up their children and to, eat healthy, as healthy as they could, given these really challenging circumstances. And what I think connects with some of what we're just talking about so far is this. I was interested in the discourse and the international development discourse around educating mothers, right? This responsibility that is placed primarily on the mothers to, in this incredibly challenging environment, to boil the water, feed their children nutritious weaning foods, a lot of emphasis breastfeeding, weaning foods, and all, wasn't a lot of attention placed on those environmental structural issues that poverty, and working within medical clinics there, where we were doing growth monitoring and dietary recalls and finding out what people were feeding their kids. There were class issues, like middle class healthcare workers, sort of disparaging parents for not raising their children. And in my mind, that was unconscionable, because I don't know how you raise a child in that environment coming from Canada. It was like, really challenging. And then fast forward to my research after that, which was really primarily in schools. Again, looking at issues around food insecurity and income inequalities and how that affects children's diets and their food, access to food. And in Canada, we don't have a national school food program. We're one of the only G7 countries that doesn't have any kind of official school food program. And so kids bring all their food from home. There's no lunches served, meals served in school. And so I was really interested in looking at what was going on in other school food programs in other countries. So one of my projects was to look to work in France, and I had a student colleague who did similar research in Japan, and we compared those school food programs to each other, and then that was helpful as well for me to think about what was going on in Canada. So really huge contrast where in Japan and France, there's a much more kind of societal responsibility for feeding children in the school, and a much more care. So this was sort of 2010s when I was doing this research. So there was a much more new attention at that point to improving policy guidelines around the kinds of food that was being served to children, and a lot of attention about how to kind of not only just feed children but teach them how to eat, which I'll talk about later when we talk more about some of the power and discourse issues. But again, this kind of interesting, I guess, to my motivation then, and I think this has been raised by others, but again, this motivation to really think of us as humans as what Hedi is called cooperative breeders, and this idea that we actually have collective responsibilities to raise our children. And yet the neoliberal discourse is always focusing on the family unit and the parents, right? And so I think school food programs really are an interesting, crucible to really examine these issues. And in Canada, we're just starting to set up a national school food program. And there's a lot of interesting debate that I'm looking at now, whereas, a lot of people are still like, why it's the parents' responsibility? Why do we want to pay taxpayer money to feed other people's children? So that is, I guess, again, a motivation to kind of dispel some of those ideas. And then again, to harness that cross-cultural perspective in anthropology, where we, what's going on in other societies and what can we learn from that. So I'll just stop there because I think we have more things to talk about.
Thank you so much. I think we'll be able to explore a lot of these themes. Among other things, Tina, thanks for very usefully highlighting, I think, both the depoliticization and the individualization of health, of parenting, of raising a child, and why that's so problematic. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about that, because I think it came up in different forms throughout everything that all three of you have said so far. And one of the interesting things about our discussion is that we have this very broad comparative perspective as well. And it's interesting to see some of the commonalities and some of the potential differences, including in relation to social perceptions about how much the state should intervene, how much of a role really the state has in this regard, as opposed to, for example, only it being the duty of the parents. And that partly leads me to my next question, which is about social practices and attitudes that shape and define what we consider as a society to be healthy and normal childhood and parenting. So there are all these broader social practices and attitudes, and this includes those of the state, schools, the food industry, health professionals, parents, which we've talked a lot about, and also children themselves, crucially. So I guess my question is, how do these various practices and attitudes shape and define what's considered normal or healthy childhood and parenting within the context that each of you have studied. So maybe we can take a different order this time just to make things more exciting. Sarah, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'll say a little bit about the state's kind of construction, as well as parents and children, but I'm sure this might be one where I'm going to be either nodding enthusiastically at things that Tina and Jennifer say, or might want to kind of come back on or expand on some of my thoughts after I hear other people's. But so I already alluded to kind of in my introduction how through my study of policy in the UK, the government is very much positioning health, firstly in childhood, as very directly related to weight. It's very much, when we think about physical health, at least, it's very much health is the thing. Sorry, weight is very much the kind of definition of that. BMI in particular is seen as a very direct, clear marker of a child's health, and that's absolutely something that I challenge, and can do more, and probably will in another discussion point we have. And again, what I alluded to earlier was that in terms of what the normal childhood body, or what a good healthy child body looks like, or how it measures, from what I have examined, is not, this healthy or normal weight that sits kind of in the middle of the kind of BMI measure, but it is kind of defined as distance from overweight and obesity. So parents who I spoke to in my PhD research had spoken to me about how, firstly, one of them had a set of two twins, both girls, one of whom was identified as overweight and one was identified as underweight. She had this letter for the overweight child that said, you need to be making all these changes. You need to do something to improve your child's health. And for the other child, it was kind of, they're underweight, they're probably fine, but, you just need to have make sure that they're okay and kind of keep in touch and check in on them. So there were two twins who the mother told me were having the same diet, liked all of the same food, were doing the same kind of after school activities, but one was marked as overweight and one was marked as under. And I think that in the materials I examined 3 times across, I think, 24 documents, 3 times was the word overweight mentioned. 2 of those 3 times, it came in this kind of paragraph that talked about the dangers of overweight, the dangers of obesity, and it was twice accompanied by this sentence, which was copied and pasted across documents, that said something very closely along the lines of, underweight can also be a concern too, so we need to check for that as well. And it felt very superficial to me. And it was then in talking to mothers that it seemed as though it really wasn't being treated as a concern. It doesn't appear to be that this healthy or normal weight is the goal, but that distance from overweight and obesity is the goal. This connects to something we've brought. I'm trying to take notes as I listen and go, but that's it. Tina, you were talking, I think, about talking about taxpayer money, people talking about taxpayer money to feed children. And I think that kind of connects here, in that I think that this kind of reluctance to pay attention to underweight is, I think, related to weight stigma and fat phobia. I think it's also related to it being much more difficult to blame underweight children on parents and parents' decisions. And I think, well, I know that there is a pattern of very class-based kind of arguments and assumptions that connect anxieties about obesity and weight with anxieties about overconsumption or misconsumption and poor decisions. And that's why overweight working class people often experience that kind of weight stigma at a much higher rate than middle class do. Or certainly they receive a kind of stigma that challenges their right to receive any kind of state support. Their bodies are seen as evidence of misconsumption, which is again not an accurate reflection. But I think that this reluctance to talk about underweight or treat it as a potential, health concern is because it can't be blamed on individual parents without calling into question kind of the state's role and responsibility and why some children might not be able to eat or might be underweight for any kind of reason. So because of that, it's kind of left to one side, and we're encouraged, I think, to think more about obesity and overweight and to think of them in terms of overconsumption and poor parenting and poor decision making. In terms of parents and children as well, again, this has come up, I think, across everyone's kind of talked about this a bit, but mothers that I spoke to were really challenging this idea that they are in total control of what their children eat. Even the kind of middle class mothers I spoke to, the mothers who spoke as though, money wasn't a problem for them, they were talking to me about how when they make a meal for the whole family, they also have to be taking into account their partner's wants and what their partner wants to eat, often male partners. Or men, husbands. Also, they were challenging this idea that children don't have any control over what they eat or have any control in the decisions. So they were talking about kind of, negotiating food-related decisions with their children, the different powers that children have in kind of helping to make decisions around food and meal choices. And mums were really challenging the idea that it is entirely up to them. Yeah, and then so another thing in terms of parenting that I wanted to talk about is they were, and I alluded to this earlier, but mums were really, in terms of the kind of discourses that they were picking up on, were really kind of pulling, back and forth or kind of weaving themselves in between these two very different discourses, one of which was kind of dominant obesity discourse, the idea that obesity equals poor health, and it's very obesity as a category can't be questioned, the idea that it's a scientific category, that it automatically equals poor health. They did kind of draw on that, and I did reflect, and maybe I can talk about this later, but I did reflect on my position as the researcher and how that might have, that could have played a role in this, but some mums I spoke to, I heard quite a lot of sentences, kind of qualifiers almost, that would say things like, obviously, I know that obesity is a big problem. I know that it's a problem. And then they would talk about their own children and their children's lives, the things they got up to, what they ate. And they were really very powerfully challenging this idea that their child is very unhealthy just because of how they are measured on this BMI scale. So there was a kind of, it's really not straightforward for mums to be challenging those discourses when they're so common sense. But they did try to, and they often did, and did so more powerfully and confidently when they were talking about their own children. But yeah, this kind of pull back and forth between those discourses was very difficult for them and put them in really difficult positions. And it pulls back to what I talked about earlier in terms of them essentially needing to make this decision between, do I stay to what I know is true and continue, feeding and doing activities with my child the way I always have done and teaching them to love their body the way that it is, or do I risk? And a lot of them did talk about this risk of developing disordered eating and unhealthy relationships with their bodies if they were to do what they were being told to do and to make changes, drastic sometimes changes to their children's lifestyles and diets to try to fit them into this narrow definition of health that BMI has laid out for us and that is being reproduced through these policies. So yeah, I think in terms of the state, the government in the UK is absolutely, I think, unsurprisingly sticking with these very widely held kind of common sense discourses about obesity and health. But then the way that they're being picked up on and reproduced and also challenged by parents and children is more complicated and demonstrates kind of opportunities for resistance to those, because when people talk about how this applies to their own lives, how these assumptions about BMI apply to their own lives, we very quickly can see that it's not as straightforward a marker of health as many people think. But yeah, those are the things that come to mind. But I'm looking forward to hearing Tina and Jennifer's as well.
Sarah, can I ask just a very brief follow-up question, just to clarify? Can you say, so this was what you're describing is based mostly on your doctoral research, which was a few years ago. Do you feel like, I'm asking this as someone living in the UK, do you feel like governmental discourse or the way in which the government thinks about childhood obesity specifically, has that changed at all since then, or would you say that not so much?
I don't think so. The program is still ongoing, even though every year there's more and more research highlighting. So, mine focused on the discourses, and by speaking to mums, it did tap into how children and particularly girls are responding to, even just in anticipation of these measurements, how they're responding. And since this, there's been research every year that's directly kind of looking at the implications of these measurements. The program is still in place. I've spoken to people who work in local authorities and local government who have to support the rollout of this program, and they, tell me that people in local government think it shouldn't be around. It is still around, but also more broadly in terms of the discourses of obesity and childhood obesity and health in the UK. I think childhood health is being talked about in other ways that will fit into some of the other webinars here in terms of engagement in, it's being thought of more holistically in kind of psychological health in terms of engagement in discussions around sex and relationships and gender. But in terms of physical health, obesity is very much still on a priority for the government, and very much being thought of in the same way that it was when I did this research. It's frustrating because there's been for many years there's been research that challenges the commonly held kind of assumptions about relationships between BMI and health. But despite that, there's still research constantly, every day being published, that even if you just read the literature review when researchers are supposed to, explain why they're studying this topic and why this topic is important, often the phrase, obesity is on the rise is just taken as, oh, okay, so we need to study it. But it seems to be exempt from that expectation that with research you would need to explain obesity is on the rise. That's bad because there's just this assumption that we all know obesity, bad, obesity on the rise, bad, therefore this research is necessary. But actually there's lots and lots of research, including quantitative positivist research, that indicates obesity does not equal the kind of apocalyptic ideas that many assume that it does. And that is continuing, and those kind of common sense assumptions about obesity continue very much to go unchallenged at the heart of policy in the UK.
Thank you. I just asked to clarify for everyone in terms of the current state of affairs.
Yeah.
Tina, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. I just want to respond to some of what Sarah was saying. I'm thinking back again to the Nepal setting in 1990s. Underweight, of course, was the concern there, but it's still very much the blame of mothers for not like actively feeding their children. So there were kind of studies that came out on children's feeding styles, right? And then one of the kind of the bad feeding styles would be the laissez-faire approach, where you just kind of have a shared family pot of food, and then, toddlers are just kind of helping themselves, and there's not like an active, put the spoon in the kid's mouth, force feeding type of thing. And so that was seen as very, especially for underweight children, was a problem for mothers. Despite the fact when I spoke with mothers and, like, some kids wouldn't eat. What did your kids eat yesterday? Not much. And part of it was just because they weren't well. They had diarrheal diseases. They didn't have a lot of an appetite. So again, though, always that focus on the parents. So I think that's like seems to be a continuing theme. The other thing I just kind of wanted to talk about, which is a bit of a change, but you mentioned industry, Hedi. So the commodification of children's food, I think, is really interesting topic. And I saw it in the 1990s, even with mothers who could ill afford to buy products like Cerelac, which is the Nestle's weaning food, and formula, infant formula. But another kind of example of that now in North America is this toddler's milk. This milk fed to kids after they finished breastfeeding or formula feeding, sort of in the 1 to 3 year old age, and it's this kind of overpriced fortified milk that is commodified or is marketed for parents, right? So preying on that fear of parents, always that fear that their kids aren't well nourished enough, right? And they need these kind of higher priced commodities to make sure their kids grow in a healthy way. And I think that's really has a huge influence on parenting and child feeding that I think we need to really pay more attention to. I know in Canada, so for example, in schools where, again, we don't have food provided in the schools, a lot of parents need to rely on like ultra processed food, quick granola bars, yogurt tubes, this sort of thing to send their kids to school with them. And again, that's not that it's unfortunate because that's become a sort of an attack on parents for feeding their kids all these schools. And I know, Jennifer, you talk about some of this with the snacks in your book, but so I'm not blaming parents at all, but the fact is that we have become dependent on a lot of these foods, and they are very, very, well marketed to parents and children because there's a big lot of money to be made in these foods, and they becoming sort of the main diet of a lot of kids, unfortunately in North America anyway. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but I think that's sort of something else to think about this, and what is the role of state, right, in regulating some of those foods. And that can be a kind of a contentious issue for sure.
And thank you so much, especially for highlighting the political economy of weight and health, because it is crucial for us to remember that there are financial interests shaping all of this discussion, all of the questions about what is a healthy weight, what are normal eating practices, and there is a market out there that is not only responding to this situation, but also constantly influencing how we think about it. So thank you for that. Jennifer?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much that I could say in response to what Sarah and Tina just said, but I guess I'll just say that, everything really resonated with me a lot. And I have a few questions that maybe I'll bring up later, but in terms of, your prompt about how these social practices and attitudes shape what's considered normal or healthy parenting or childhood, I mentioned earlier some of those discourses that were interesting to me in the ways parents, I think, felt conflict between that need to regulate versus the need to not be overly controlling. And I do think that really taps into some key things about, if we want to call it neoliberal personhood. I don't think we can chalk everything up to neoliberalism. It goes back further than that, but I do think that something is captured there, right, about the importance of self-regulation, of making sure your children are self-regulating. But then, since they're supposed to be autonomous, you should not be seen as one who seeks to control others. That's a distasteful personal quality. But then part of that, too, I think, was this, and I guess this gets back to kind of what Sarah was talking about, how much that then those ways of framing the problems of children's food and parenting then end up framing this largely as a problem of, as a parent, do you care enough to do this right. And then we take out a lot of the structural questions that are happening here, right? From, does this particular family have enough resources, to, is this a corporate commodification of children's food that is, to the detriment of everybody? So yeah, that, again, points to how these constructions of healthy, if you want to call it healthy parenting, have a lot of class work embedded in them, not only in how there are class identities wrapped up in food, but also in these assumptions of like, well, you just have to pay attention and you just have to really make mindful choices. And these are the things you do if you care enough. And some, I in my fieldwork, I heard sometimes parents talking about, or administrators talking about, certain parents who could be more affluent or less affluent being checked out, which meant that they were packing like a junky lunch for their children at school, or letting their kids get fast food for lunch or something. But, there are lots of things packed into why that situation is the way it is, right? But it gets, then framed as this issue of, do you care enough? And if you don't care enough, that obviously makes you a bad parent. And then that takes us away from a lot of other things, as I think social scientists we would want to talk about. But the other thing that spoke to me about this question was thinking about ideas of normal or healthy childhood, and something that I wasn't, really expecting, that I came across or hadn't thought about in advance anyway in my research, was understanding how people would talk about normal childhood and healthiness as sometimes in tension with one another, in the sense that there were kind of an underlying set of assumptions that kids naturally are drawn to junky food. So if it's super processed, if it's carbs, if it's sugar, like, kids naturally are drawn to that stuff. And so your job as a parent is to guide them in a healthier direction. So that's a whole dilemma, of course, this sort of idea that somehow you're supposed to accomplish then this task without being overly controlling of your child, but also understanding that it's kind of counter their animal nature to want to eat the broccoli and not the ice cream. So, something I found particularly interesting about that was to watch kids in school kind of positioning themselves in different ways vis-a-vis these discourses and the ways adults were framing nutrition and adults were framing what childhood meant. So sometimes I saw kids, really, whether it was because I had asked them a question or because of something they had initiated, but really being able to very well articulate some ideas about what was healthy food that would be very much aligned with what their parents would say or what their teachers would say. But then in other moments, they might have been kind of almost like performing the rebelliousness that a child is entitled to. Like, I'm a kid, therefore I like sugar. Look at me eating all this sugar. And kind of playing to that understanding that to some extent, kids are expected to do that and kind of allowed to do that. And that it's part of what makes kids different from adults. And, I thought that also was reflected when, like, one aspect of parents' ambivalence would be, on the one hand, a real concern with proper kinds of regulation. On the other hand, saying things like, well, I don't want my kids to look back on their childhood and feel like they didn't have like a fun, real birthday party or something, which means cake and ice cream and all the things and the treats. So they've got to have the treats. That's like childhood. But then people feel conflict between providing those things and making sure their kids don't get much of those things. Or sometimes parents would feel annoyed that, like, people out in the community or at school would be giving their kids this thing. And that meant that they as parents couldn't be the one to provide the treat. And they wanted to be seen as the treat giver sometimes for what it represented in terms of like love or care of their child. So, and just to sum up, I guess I've had a really interesting moment once when I was talking to a group of middle schoolers about some of these issues, and they volunteered a kid, it's probably like a 13-year-old kid, I guess, who said something like, if a student in this school walking down the hall eating a candy bar is going to be perceived differently than if a teacher is walking down the hall eating a candy bar. And it was this really interesting moment of, them showing me what I was just kind of starting to understand, like how deeply these differences in health were connected not only to class differences, but also with ideas of maturity and care, like adulthood versus childhood, that in some ways what makes you a child is like the imprudence of the wrong choices, and what makes you adult is the prudence of the better choices. And then when you kind of mix that in with the class inequity questions, it becomes even clearer like how loaded these conversations are.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I think what I'll do, let's do kind of a speed round in the sense that I'll give you two topics to think about, but each of you can decide what you want to focus on, because I think in different ways we've already alluded to both themes. The first has to do with something that came up in all of your comments, which is you all commented on class, and I think Tina, a number of times you mentioned culture when you talked about some of your findings. So it would be interesting to hear if you have any further thoughts about how power dynamics around class and culture and other identity categories, I'm thinking here about gender, sexuality, disability, nationality, how power dynamics around these other identity categories shape the way in which we think about and respond to children and food. So any thoughts you have about that? A second thing I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if you'd like to respond to, is what you think we need to change, what you think experts, practitioners need to change at all, and also society more generally needs to change in how it deals with this issue, and specifically how it approaches children, how it involves children, and how it empowers children in relation to food. We've talked a lot about parents and the state and other adult actors. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts about that, if you have any. Tina, would you like to start this time?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me first.
Sorry.
There's so much to think about or say.
Yeah,
These are great questions, Hedi. I'll just sort of talk about, again, I think about school food programs, because that's kind of where my head's right now in my research. And I have been thinking, because we're rolling out this school food program in Canada, so I've been thinking a lot about how do we make, include diversity, equity, and inclusion in these school food programs. And I know that's become a bad word, or bad concept, according to Trump. But I think that this is really, really crucial to think about this in terms of class and race and ethnicity and so forth. And I'll quickly just mention that in my research in France, for example, while very impressed with the school food program, I identified some areas of exclusion that were really disturbing. In that, so I talk about in one of my papers about gastro citizenship. So there's very much a project to make enculturate children into eating a certain way, a French way, through the school food programs, which is laudable in many ways. But unfortunately, there are issues with not providing consistent vegetarian meals, for example, for children, and not wanting to include halal food, for example, in school food programs there, because of this concept of laïcité in France and the society of the secular school or secular state. So I think that that is very complicated for when we think about how we want children to eat. Again, this notion, what we're wrestling with right now in Canada is like, what is healthy food, right? Who gets to define what healthy food is? And how are we in our school boards going to kind of come up with that? And we have a very diverse cultural society here in Canada. So how do we accommodate all of these different ways that people eat? And it's not just cultural diversity, it's also class diversity, right? So thinking about what is healthy, in one kind of, in terms of thinking about like taste, like Bourdieu's idea around taste, right? What is considered, food that people want to eat, that's tasty, that is, and then how do we translate that into being healthy? And to answer to then think about your question about how do we do that in terms of policy, and this really challenging, and this is what we're facing right now in Canada. We have the chance to roll out a new system and learn from some of the things that haven't gone so well in other systems. Equity is another issue, right? Equity in terms of how a school food program gets funded. And I know there are a lot of equity issues in the US that a number of people have talked about, and in the UK as well. I think some of the European countries are doing a little bit better, but how do we make sure that kids from different socioeconomic classes, households get equitable nutrition in schools? So that I think is supposed to be a speed lightning round, so I'll stop there and pass it over.
Thank you so much. Hopefully, we will have time towards the end to return to some of the issues if you'd like. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think so. I guess you had two questions. I will maybe focus on the second one, as Tina did, because I feel like some of the key things I wanted to say about class, age, I kind of already covered. I'm very much on the same page with Tina here. I do tend to think that there should be more state regulation of what corporations put out there for us. And I'm also a fan of the idea of school lunch, specifically free school lunch. The US has federal school lunch programs. Janet Poppendieck wrote a book I thought was great called Free for All that made the argument that when you provide free school lunch for all kids, not only the ones who can't afford it, the kids from the lower income families end up eating much better than they do when it's a more stigmatized, class differentiated program. And I don't know that there's a lot of support for that in the United States, but it's interesting that we had a brief moment of providing something more like that during the pandemic, and then it went away. But that is definitely something that I'm interested in. And the other thing I wanted to say about that is something that Tina also touched on, which is, and I don't have a good answer for this, but one of the things that I think about and struggle with, I know that I don't have the answers for, is if we want to have an equitable, say, school lunch program that is covering all children as a matter of course, or if we want to have better regulation of food quality and so on, it means that we are making some decisions, not that this isn't already been talked about, but we're making some decisions about what represents healthy food. And then, of course, anytime that's defined, that is a power-ridden process. And to some extent, it's linked with empirical science about what nutritionists are telling us, but that science changes all the time. And then there are broader ideas, kind of similar to what Sarah was pointing to, I think, earlier. They're broader ideas of what represents health. And so how would we come up with some kind of more universal care programs while somehow keeping an eye on making participation and deciding what is healthy or healthy enough, or striking those balances somehow making that conversation inclusive of people who have a range of tastes, who have been eating, say, those processed foods for all the different reasons. Doing anything that's kind of imagined to be the best for everybody across the board has a lot of kind of patriarchal, patronizing potential to it. So how do we solve that problem? I don't know, but that seems like kind of the dilemma that we're facing to me to do. And then you asked anyway to do, I would love if we would do a much better job of taking care of children's food in a more equitable state-led way, but at the same time, how do we do that in a way that doesn't exacerbate certain problems we have about who gets to say what's healthy?
Thank you. Sarah?
Yes, I'll try and quick fire. I do want to talk a little bit about the first question as well, in terms of kind of power dynamics related to different kind of modes of oppression. We've talked about class in detail. One thing I wanted to kind of highlight was how a lot of the mainstream kind of common sense obesity research that we see is often taken or studying children directly from kind of lists of the most deprived families, families living in poverty. A lot of that research directly seeks to study obesity and BMI as it exists in those groups. As well as that, I just wanted to also call attention to how a lot of that research is also very kind of racialized. There's a lot of research that some of it draws from those programs and also seeks explicitly, in the kind of research aims to compare the BMI, the parenting practices, and the eating habits of marginalized families with white families quite often. In the UK, that's often comparing Pakistani families to white British families. In the US, it's often Latina families compared to white, and Black families are compared to white families in both the US and UK that I know. And as I said, they often explicitly set out to kind of compare these two groups, and they're often positioning white British families as the kind of norm, the control group almost. Well, yeah, I would say the control group, and kind of trying to understand, starting research from a position of what is this marginalized group doing wrong that's making their children be more likely to be marked as overweight, or adults to be more likely to be marked as overweight. But a lot of obesity research in childhood and adulthood operates from these racialized and racist kind of ideas about health and practices, and positioning white people and white families as the norm of health to which others should be compared against. And that includes, there's also comparisons of all white British families, but obviously speaking, in terms of British research, but then comparing working class British families, white British families, to middle class. So there's always this kind of comparator group that is always raced as being white, as those who are most likely to be healthy, have healthy lives, have healthy habits. And then within class as well, it's classed in that way, where it's always middle class families that are seen as the group to which others should be compared to. I just wanted to mention that just because I think that raced aspect to it is kind of important. It is important to talk about as well. In terms of what changes are needed, you asked what changes are needed to empower children and parents. I agree with what Jennifer and Tina have both said. My kind of thought process in terms of what needs to change is often related to approaches to research and policy. So I absolutely think that weight screening programs such as the National Child Measurement Programme in the UK should be completely abolished. I think childhood health in policy and research needs to be understood more holistically, but I realize that's not a straightforward thing to say with what I kind of spoke about earlier in terms of now there's worries about children's health in all of these panics about them being exposed to the knowledge that trans people exist, as if that's going to have an impact on their health, which I don't agree with. But those are the only kind of things I'm seeing in terms of thinking about health more holistically, in terms of not just weight, but other aspects of health, which I do think we need to see changes to. And I also think that BMI as a measure of health and bodies is completely useless. Based on very flawed, if you understand the kind of beginnings of BMI, which I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about in the questions and answers, but I will do, is it was created at first to just be just a measure of how in a given population people's weight changes as their height changes. It was given to be just a kind of a visual show of what the population average is. That has stayed rigid, and bodies have changed as we've gone through time and as our environments have changed. But this idea of what a healthy body looks like is still based on this average that was constructed based off of white, Western men, middle class, or I think even rich, the very richest men, that was put together a very, very long time ago. We're talking hundreds of years ago. And BMI also changes completely. I can't think of the word, but I think it was 2011, they just arbitrarily changed the cutoff point for overweight. They pulled it forward about 3 points. So at the click of a finger, millions of people just suddenly became overweight. And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with when we talk about BMI. So I would argue that BMI is not a helpful measure of health. It's not a useful predictor of health or mortality. And I would like to see that used much, much less in policy and in research. So that's a change that I would say is needed, is doing away with BMI and the kind of screening programs and massive decisions made about children's health that are based on such a flawed measure. Yeah.
Thank you all. We could talk so much more about all of this, but I do want to use the time we have left. First of all, if anyone in the audience would like to comment or ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or turn on your camera, and I'll turn to you. In the meantime, I do want to read a comment and a question from the chat. Jennifer Pope had to leave a couple of minutes ago, but she wrote, "Thank you all to all the presenters. It's been very interesting to hear your perspectives, experiences, and research. Similar challenges here in Ireland. In my own work with undergrad college students, I find that we have to unpack their own cultural bias and tendencies to blame." So she apologizes for having to leave, but thank you, Jennifer. There was also a question here from Holutsale Huneti to you, Sarah. I think in a way you didn't maybe answer it numerically, but I think you helped us think very critically about the framing. The question is how many, I guess, what's the exact percentage of obesity among children in the UK? Are there any? I know I have many other questions. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Anna, go ahead. Yeah, just unmute yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Anna. I'm an anthropologist. I'm ethnologist, a Kurd anthropologist, also youth worker coming from Slovenia. And yes, we have a very nice system here in Slovenia. We get food in the schools. And now we have, like, how to say, it's called the breakfast. It's a healthy breakfast. They're practicing. So it's a very good system we're having, but a lot of children are having now different allergies. So it's very difficult for schools, to have a breakfast, So some of children bring food in the school. Some of them are bringing who are eating in the school, but they have a lot of allergies, so a lot of people doesn't know what to do, so but if we also have like a lunch boxes for the children who can offer the school meals, so it's good system. It starts from the kindergarten and it's going to the high schools. So in the high school, especially in gymnasiums, you can do stuff, but I'm now working like a professional nanny, and I'm facing a lot of problems like struggling. Children sometimes doesn't want to eat because they have some problems. Also, when I hear I see it from holistic approach, when parents are like a noisy or they fight each other, children doesn't eat. And I'm working with some girl who she doesn't want to drink when the father is at home, but she's always drinking when me and my mother are at home. So I don't know what to do exactly. But I'm also working on my doctorate thesis, so it will be nice that I can get some contact, which is about the children, but it's on the migration. But I face my stories when I was working with the refugees. They were Ukraine here in Slovenia. They very hard to adapt the eating. Children didn't eat because they didn't have sense. Different food, very big problems. So it was very nice to hear the practice. But what I discovered, for me, it's like when I'm like seeing from these children that I work also in colonies and youth worker, I see it's a ritual. They have some rituals, and they want to follow these rituals. Yeah, and they really, some of the children that I work, they eat specific food, but when I'm looking different families, they have very like socialistic approach. No sweets, just one sweet per week, when another family has like a normal ones. So that's my opinion. I think it's children is very important ritual. Waking up in the morning. And also I discovered that in Slovenia, especially what I'm observing is that parents doesn't want to cook anymore, so they just go to take them, and they really eat healthy food more at the grandparents than at home. It doesn't depend of the class that I discover. So that's my opinion. But if we any have questions, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I saw another hand being raised. Was it Khulud? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yes, it's correct. And hello, hi, you pronounced it correctly. Hi, hello. Thank you very much, first of all, for this interesting discussion. Actually, my question, I wanted to make it short. It's long for Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for you and for others also. Actually, I asked before, do you have any idea about the percentage of childhood obesity in UK?
Yeah, so I don't know off the top of my head what the percentage of how many children would be marked as obese in the UK is.
Any close, for example, is it around 30, 40%, something
I'm
like
not.
this?
Well, I wouldn't want to say and be wrong, but you would be able to find that by if you type in NCMP UK, you'll get the latest stats from them, which is this. One thing I did want to say about that as well is, for me, and this is just for me, but and my kind of thinking around it, but in terms of having a percentage of obesity, what that tells me is if I see how many, what the percentage of children being marked as obese is, it tells me how many children are, kind of getting advice and ideas, probably to their parents and from various professionals about how they should be changing their diets, but it doesn't tell me anything useful about how many children are at risk of poor health in the UK in terms of their weight. So I kind of said this very briefly in my kind of quick fire answer at the end, but with BMI being, kind of bell curve, if BMI worked in the way that it was supposed to when it was created, there would be a very small number of people marked in that way because they would be at the, the tail end of that bell curve. So the idea that is essentially what I'm saying is, and I don't think I'm explaining it very well, but the word obesity is based on this BMI measure. And I don't think that BMI measure is helpful for getting the scale of how many children are kind of at risk of poor health. So my short answer to that question is I don't know what the percentage is, but for me, having that percentage isn't helpful in terms of understanding the state of childhood health in the UK anyway, other than it does give me an indication of how many children may be having their bodies and their parents and their families kind of pathologized. So for me, understanding the percentage of obesity isn't a helpful indicator of health, but does give me an indication of how many children and families are being affected by these kind of messages about obesity and health.
Yes, yes. Thank you. This is very, very, very into the point, which is what I wanted to clarify. Actually, I have a degree in communication media studies, and my main core specialist in public relation advertising, and my research is concentrating on media psychology and children and health communication related to parents and children. So your answer is fit with what I am thinking. I totally 100% agreeing with you. Actually, I did study. It's 10 years before, and still keeping and on working on it about the. I'm from Jordan, first of all, and from the Middle East, which is interesting to see the other part of the world. In Jordan, the percentage of the obesity among the children is around 50% of the population. So always I was wondering something, is it always related to the health issues? What I found, I connected this issue with the media studies. So, sorry. So I was searching, and I adopted 3 types of collecting data. First of all, I recorded 116 hours of one of very popular and famous cartoon channel among the Middle East Arabic countries specifically. And this cartoon channel called MBC3. So I recorded 116 hours of advertisement for 1 month, okay? And I divided it into 2 types, into weekdays, different than weekend, okay? Because the hours, watching hours for the children in weekend is different than the weekdays. Okay, it's a long study because it took almost 2.5 years to do it. And then, so I did content analysis. I did interviews also. I did focus group with the children. Sorry, it was 4 methods, not the 3. And then I did surveys with parents. I found that one of major, not minor, reasons for increasing the obesity type 2, which is the hidden one. Type 1 is clear for the health sector. It's clear for the symptoms. They know that the children, they have obesity. Whereas the type 2 still, it's in the process to become, how to say, I forgot the word, still not appeared, or still there is no symptoms, okay? So it's in the way to show that this group of children are going to have obesity in the future, okay? So my target group, my target age group was 5 to 10. There is a huge percentage of the children, they are consuming junk food in, I don't want to say in a crazy way, but I wanted to say in not educated way, okay? So one of the things,
if I can just ask you to
yes.
keep your comment short. I don't know if you have
Sorry
a
for
question
this.
or no, it's okay. It's okay. Just thank you.
Okay. So long story short, I'm ready if after this meeting for any contact just to share, because my point is that if we share, we can do something like a comparison study between the East and West, and I'm ready to do this because I would like to continue in this, and this I agree with Sarah and with Tina and Jennifer when they emphasize about that there is always a problem about the children, and especially I believe that now after the corona, after the COVID, this issue related to the eating habits becomes much worse. So I would like to stop here because if I continue talking about the study, it will not finish. It will take more than 1 hour. So thank you very much. I will leave my contact if you would like. I would like very much to be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Khulud, for
Thank
joining
you
from
very much
Jordan.
for the opportunity.
And
Sorry for interrupting. And I'm sorry I can't open my camera. I have a flu. I'm very tired.
thank you for joining us. You're welcome to put your contact in the chat. We've had comments and questions from 3 countries so far: Jordan, Ireland, and Slovenia, if I remember correctly. Because we're coming to an end, I'll just read the last comment we have in the chat, which is from the Faroe Island. For those who don't know, the Faroe Island is an independent territory of Denmark, which has a population of 50,000 people. I'm adding that for context. And the comment is, our food heritage is increasingly at risk as the generations who preserve this knowledge gradually pass away. In place of traditional food sources, processed foods such as white sugar, white bread, and ultra processed potato products step in. So obviously there's this cultural global capitalism angle as well, which you've all alluded to in different ways. I'll just allow, before we come to a close, I know there's so much more we could say, but time has run up, unfortunately. Jennifer, Tina, you haven't said anything, especially now, but also Sarah, if you have anything to add, would you like to add any concluding words, Jennifer?
I think I just want to thank everybody. It was great to hear from you all, and there's certainly a lot of overlap amongst us in terms of our perspectives on these things. So I hope we get to work again together in the future.
Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, I just responding just quickly to the Faroe Island comment, and I think again, I mean, I keep going on about school food programs, but I think in terms of thinking about food heritage, you know, those programs are where we can do a lot of that work, right? And that I think some countries, again, I've talked about France and Japan, have been very good at trying to hold on to some food heritage through their school food program. So that means, you know, a lot of investment in those programs and careful thought and planning. And I guess the other point, I know, I think it was in one of the questions, Hedi, that you sent, but we never really got to it, was just this idea of starting to include children more in our research. And I know I've done not much of it, a little bit, but I really feel like in going forward, that's kind of where I want to focus more now, because, and not just so much research, medical research in particular, or diet nutrition research. It's just, you know, asking kids questions, but using them as subjects or objects, sort of objectifying them, and, you know, not really giving them a voice. And I think we need to do more of that, because children, I mean, I think Jennifer talked a little bit about sort of the autonomy of children, and the comment from Slovenia too about children are autonomous. They make decisions about what they want to eat and don't want to eat, and they have to be included in this conversation. And there's so many problems with, you know, ethics and research and reasons why we don't always include them. But I think we have to really try to make an effort as much as we can to do that.
Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. My research focused on mothers, which I think was helpful in kind of looking at how the discourses I was looking at are negotiated by the people who they're aimed at, I guess. But yeah, I'm conscious of I think it'd be really valuable for many reasons to kind of hear from children directly. I think despite it being much more complicated ethics-wise and needing to be careful, especially when we're talking about things like food and bodies.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that I think that the effort involved with getting through those kind of ethical requirements is worth it for what we could kind of learn from children. I think that would be incredibly valuable. I don't think I've got anything to add in terms of the topic of conversation, but just that I've enjoyed having these conversations. I really enjoyed the format, and it's been really lovely to meet all of you, Tina, Hedi, Jennifer, as well as the people in the chat. Yeah, it's felt good and powerful to have these conversations. Not necessarily good because I think we're talking about frustrating inequalities and frustrating discourses, but it is good to be in a space where people are talking about and naming these. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you
I
all.
just-
This has been fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, circling
Yeah.
back now to what the others just said.
Absolutely.
I have
yeah.
really, in terms of models for involving kids in research, I really enjoyed the work of Elizabeth Chen with children in Connecticut. Her study of consumption amongst children, and modeled a little piece of what I did after that. Actually try to work with kids to teach them some ethnographic methods and get them to kind of produce some of their own new knowledge, newly reflective knowledge of what they do in their own lives. So anyway, shout out to Elizabeth Chen.
Thank you for that reference. And thanks again to everyone. This has been fascinating. A recording of the event, as I've said, will be available online. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. For the three speakers, if you could stay afterwards, but otherwise, thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
care.
everybody.